Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining. It's a great privilege to be NAMI's Chief Medical Officer. And having gone gray, I've met a lot of smart people over time. One of them is Dr. Eric Elbajan, who's a psychologist and a professor at Duke University's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Health. Eric and I met at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center when I had brown hair. And he reached out to me saying, Ken, I've written this book on violence and mental illness, how to understand the literature. And once I got that email, I asked him, could you please send me a copy? He sent me a copy, and I found it to be thoughtful, reasonable, evidence-based, and reassuring in some fundamental ways. Because pre-pandemic, I would say this was among the most common questions that I was asked by media folks about the relationship between violence and mental illness. I want to remind you, we have about 800 people on this call. Put your questions in the chat. I'll do my absolute best to group them into categories of questions that I'll be asking the good doctor after we're done. So next slide, please. Conversations around violence can include, things that can be triggering or upsetting. We have an incredibly capable team of people who are trained to take calls. It's a warm line of support. It's not a suicide prevention hotline. That's the 988 number. But we have people who are here to help. If you want to talk to somebody during this presentation or during the hours of 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. Monday to Friday, we serve tens of thousands of people a year through chat, text, and phone calls. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the good doctor. So again, he's a psychologist and he did forensic training. And I think some of his work in the forensic criminal justice space helped him develop this interest in understanding what is and isn't true about the relationship between violence and mental illness. So, Eric, I want to thank you for joining us, for donating your time to NAMI, and for the work that you have done in your career, because I think you're dispelling a lot of negative stereotypes. And so let me start by saying thank you and take it away.
No, well, thank you, Ken, for having me be here. It's an honor. And thank you, Katie, for helping orchestrate this and the polls we're about to do in a second of everyone here. I'm going to want to know about who you are in the audience and what you're most interested in. But it really is my real honor to be here to present. And so what I want to know is, before even talking about this topic, who are you? Thanks for answering this. And we'll have the poll answers on in about 10 to 15 seconds. Okay. So, okay, you could see, so about six out of 10 family members, and a third people who have lived experience, and 30% mental health professional. Thank you. And now, what is drawing you to this topic? What do you find most important to you? You can select all that apply or what's most important, but what I want to do is, in a way, these are actually what we're going to talk about for the next hour and a half. And also I want to see and make sure that I cover and address why the subject matter of this talk for you. So please answer those. Okay. So, okay, wow. Okay, well, I guess this is very helpful for me to know. We will definitely be going over the science and talk about what the impact of blaming mental illness for violence does, and also how we can move towards effectively reducing violence. And I want to say before I go on, given what I'm seeing right now, I know that this is a difficult topic. I have worked with people with mental illness for over 30 years, and I want to acknowledge that from the beginning that this is emotional. It can be triggering, like Ken said, and um, I want to just thank you for having the courage to be here to listen to this, and just want to acknowledge that I understand this is a difficult topic. I hope that something that I talk about stays with you and helps you and your family out. What I am going to talk about today is violence. And by violence, I'm going to be reviewing studies and research with that definition that you see. It's when someone hurts someone else or threatens even if they don't hurt them, threatens them with lethal or serious harm. I won't be specifically looking at suicide or gun violence. So I'm talking about violence generally. By mental illness, the research on it has really, it falls under what SAMHSA calls serious mental illness. So we're going to be looking at research on psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, and major depressive disorders. And that's what I'm going to use the term mental illness because that's what the research calls it. And about 20% of people in the United States have a diagnosis of one of those three at some point in their lives. So that's what we'll be talking about. But you're not off the hook yet for polls because I want you to get engaged in this. I'm going to be asking 3 more questions. Because we're talking about violence, I want you to start thinking about, well, it's not only going to be about mental illness, but what other factors do you think are the strongest factors for intimate partner violence? And if you scroll down, what's the most frequent risk factor for mass attacks in public places and risk factors for a perceived top cause of violence? So that's what people think. Question number 3 is what do people think is the top cause of violence? Number 2 is what is the most frequent risk factor for mass attacks? And what is the strongest risk factor for intimate partner violence? Please answer those and we'll see the answers in a second. Okay. Okay, so the strongest risk factor for intimate partner violence was direct access to guns. Um, the strongest risk factor for mass attacks was stressors in the environment, and the top perceived cause of violence was mental illness. I could tell you, I'm going to show you in a second, that is super impressive because the highest answers are the correct ones. But here's what this talk, if you're gonna take away anything from this talk, is if you have polls and there are studies and surveys that ask what is the strongest risk factor for violence, mental illness is almost always listed as one of the top ones. But the reality, and this is just for 6 different types of violence, it's never, ever ranked among the top 5 risk factors for violence. And I'm going to show you that today. So the reality is very different than the perception. And so the first thing is mental illness is not necessary for violence. And you've probably heard the statistic before, but about 5% of violence can be attributed to mental illness, but the vast majority of people with mental illness are peaceful and nonviolent. And that also means mental illness is not sufficient for violence to occur. Those are not symptoms of mental illness: hatred, lacking empathy, criminal thinking. Uh, and people with mental illness are actually much more likely to be victims of violence than those without mental illness. But what happens? How does it get exaggerated? Well, you'll have a violent incident that gains national attention. Unfortunately, a lot of everyone will recognize this because we've been in the cycle many times. Maybe there's mental illness involved, maybe not. But even when it's not, it's brought up in an early stage. There's guessing, there's no mental health person is evaluated. And in fact, a lot of times what happens is there'll be a case where the person has mental health problems, but then it morphs into mental illness. To get more information, it takes days to get more about the perpetrator's background. And people have gone on to other stories. And so what remains in people's minds is mental illness. So this is what imagine violence is like a jigsaw puzzle. And it's like you pick up a single piece of the puzzle, the mental illness piece, and say, oh, I've solved it. That's what's going on. And that doesn't make any sense. But when tragedy happens, people think fast, they feel emotional, they're non-reflective, and they want a quick and clear answer. The thing is, violence has many factors. There isn't a single cause, and that gets missed, that gets forgotten. Each act of violence is like a puzzle with multiple pieces. I'm going to talk about that today. And if there's another thing that you might take away from today is not only is the link between mental illness and violence weaker than is perceived, but because of that exaggerated link, that de-emphasizes and takes attention away from multiple other risk factors that are actually stronger. So, for example, history of criminal behavior, financial instability, not keeping guns safe, being male, personality traits like antisocial personality traits, lacking empathy. Those are actually stronger predictors, but they don't necessarily make it to those headlines. And so that's one of the issues that happens, is that we need to remember that violence is not just that one puzzle piece, but there's a lot of puzzle pieces involved. And I'm going to probably repeat that quite a bit, because I think that that's part of the key to not only fighting stigma against and the exaggeration of violence and mental illness, but actually the key to preventing violence in society. So we want to oversimplify causes, society does, the news and media make the connection seem worse than it is. And there's also sometimes really stigmatizing language that makes it sound like in horrible language that says, oh, them and not us. So it's taking, all of those function taking away the attention from other risk factors that really do contribute to violence. And those then feed into our cognitive biases. So if you haven't heard of this, there's a whole host of these biases that all people have. One of them is the availability heuristic. It's this idea that if something happens and we ask ourselves, oh, why did that happen? And the answer comes to mind quickly, then we incorrectly think that's an important reason. So if it's quick and available, we think it's important. That's not true. But if the media is constantly saying, oh, mental illness, then it's the first thing that's going to come. And then we have this bias to assume that that's what's going on. And that's important. The other thing is the fundamental attribution error. That is this tendency that we have to blame the person and not the environment, to discount the environment of a person. And so that's also, in some research I did actually, on clinicians, that these are not just in the public, but also clinicians. A lot of people have this fundamental attribution error where the mental illness is made more is exaggerated in terms of it's distorted because you're not considering other factors. So if there's all this exaggeration, well, what does this research really show? And I apologize in advance. It's maybe a little dry. I'll do my best to make it interesting. This is gonna be like what is the research? And maybe a side thing will be I'm going to talk about like what the strengths and limitations are of different kinds of studies. So that might be good for you to evaluate studies in the future. But the first study of this that really came out was in the early 90s. It was this national study, and they did this structured diagnosis, which was really strong, but it was at a single time point, and it was self-reported violence. And what they showed was that violence was related to being younger, being male, lower socioeconomic status, substance use, and mental illness. But it was looked at 15 years later, and what they found is that link between violence and mental illness, actually a third of that connection was due to stressful life events and lack of social support. So the take home for that is if you only look at the link between violence and mental illness in isolation, without considering the fact that that link, a whole bunch of it is associated, like mental illness is associated with stressful life events, and so is violence. And so there's another factor involved. And you could see the quote on the bottom is statistically, if you're only looking at two things, you might be missing that third. And that's really a confound. It's called a confound. In this case, that means that a lot of those events, that link between mental illness and violence, a good third of it is due not to the mental illness, but to stressful life events and lack of social support. So I think that that's beginning to show that this link between mental illness and violence is not as direct as one might think. The next study, this is the gold standard study, the MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study. They followed people, they interviewed them every 10 weeks. They had multiple violence measures, criminal arrest, self-report, family report, a whole host of, I think the clinician report. They followed them longitudinally, so it wasn't one time point, and they had a structured diagnosis. The downside is that and those were psychiatric hospitals in different states, but it's not a national sample. What they find, it was not predicted by mental illness alone. Violence was not. It was co-occurring substance abuse, mental illness, and by specific, not diagnosis, but by psychiatric symptoms of hostility and grandiose delusions. But look at this bottom study. This one I think is so important. They looked at the people who had psychotic disorders, and they looked at, before they were violent, whether they were having psychotic symptoms. And only about 1 in 10 of those times was the perpetrator who had a psychotic disorder, were they experiencing psychotic symptoms. That means almost by definition that in 9 out of 10 cases among people with mental illness, it wasn't the psychotic symptoms that were causing the violence. Some other risk factors had to be playing a role. And it's another thing to think about. It's beginning to get more complicated. It's more direct. Wait, is there a link between violence and mental illness? Well, not diagnosis, maybe symptoms, co-occurring substance abuse is relevant. It's getting more complicated. I'll summarize it. But I think the take home from this is that at this point, it's beginning to seem like that link between violence and mental illness is not as strong as direct as typically thought. The next study, this was 34,000 participants. It was the benefit was that it was a national sample. It was representative of the United States. There was structured diagnosis. It was longitudinal, but again, it was self-reported violence, which is underreported typically. And what was found was not totally dissimilar is that without substance abuse, the individuals with mental illness were not more likely to engage in severe violence. And this and this was this study that I was on, and began to look at. Remember, I was saying that wait, there's other things that co-occur with mental illness and violence. Childhood abuse. There's these vulnerabilities that people with mental illness have, like lower income, being violently victimized, that are also violence risk factors. So it's becoming apparent. It's really hard. It's in fact artificial to separate the mental illness from all the other risk factors people who have mental illness might or might not have. This is a figure from this study. Now, look at those two. I'm going to explain what this is in a second, but those two arrows, and I apologize, I am partially colorblind, but I think they're yellow. And what those are is, this is from that sample of 30,000 people. And what you could see is that the none and the A are just the people in that sample who had mental illness, and whether they were on the left, whether they were violent in the next 3 years. And you could see that absent the substance abuse and history of violence, they're almost identical. There's no difference. But that doesn't mean that mental illness is irrelevant. And the only difference between the two arrows to the right now is the mental illness. So what it shows is that when mental illness is co-occurring with substance abuse and history of violence, in this case, then that actually is elevating risk of violence. So this also shows the intricacy of that link between violence and mental illness. And the mental illness alone, absent the substance abuse and history of violence, is not. I mean, it's not really. Those are definitely equivalent on the left, but you could see the difference in B plus C and A plus B plus C is severe mental illness. And so that does mean that there is some contribution. The last is these studies from the Swedish registries. You could see that they had decades worth of data for the entire population. And so it was national samples, longitudinal, it was criminal records. But because it was these national samples, there was not the control of a structured diagnosis like the other studies. But what did they find? Not very dissimilar, was when schizophrenia now little statistics here. Odds ratios, OR. What that means over there, the 4.4 means that people who had both schizophrenia and substance abuse were 4.4 times more likely than people without mental illness to have violent crime. But look at the schizophrenia alone. That's 1.2. That's much lower. And what that means is that having schizophrenia alone meant you were 1.2 times more likely to be violent than the general population. So that, again, it's slightly more than the general population. It's not 1. If it was 1, it would be exactly the same. But it shows that there is a slight increase of schizophrenia alone, but much less than when it's co-occurring with substance abuse. Same thing with bipolar disorder. Very similar finding for that. And so I think that that's really important to think about, that this is complex. And I people want to have simple answers, especially in the wake of tragedies. But the problem is, the reality is that there is this complexity that you're seeing. Well, people with mental illness face these risks and vulnerabilities that they might have to do with people's mental illness, financial strain, social stress. You saw that a third of the link between violence and mental illness in that study was attributable to the social stress, not the mental illness. And also, as a diagnosis, it wasn't consistent. Now, symptoms like hostility and grandiose delusions were in the MacArthur study shown, but mental illness had a weaker connection. And even among people with mental illness, the symptoms preceded only like a fraction of the violent incident, meaning that there are other, it's almost revealing that there had to be other risk factors at play other than mental illness. It's too simple to say that mental illness doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's embedded in a network of a lot of other risk factors. It includes other multiple risk factors. And here's the thing. A lot of the research has, imagine you're in a dark room and you have a flashlight and you're beaming that flashlight on violence and mental illness, right? But turn on the lights and suddenly like there's a whole bunch of like, wait a second, how do, and that's what that research does. It looks at violence and mental illness, but what about all these other risk factors? When you turn on the lights, there are a ton of other risk factors to look at. So how does mental illness compare to those? And then what kind, those are general kinds of violence. What about specific types of violence? When I asked you those polling questions, it began to get at, I asked what the strongest was. And so when we start looking at how does mental illness compare to other factors, this is a new set of inquiries. And unlike mass shootings, although the vast majority of mass shootings and mass murder are actually associated with domestic violence, there are over 500,000 domestic violence incidents a year. It's far, far more common than the well-publicized mass shootings. But you could see it, and it's not even mental illness, it's mental health issues. Now, on the bottom, it says effect size. What you need to know is that shows how strong, it's not just whether or not it's significant, it's how strong the effect is. And you could see that direct access to guns is a very large effect. Mental health issues, not even mental illness, was a small effect. And once you begin to realize, wait a second, there's all these other variables, and mental illness is not ranked really high. Sexual violence, also common, much more common than a lot of the mass shootings. Mental illness is not in the top 10, and you're seeing a small effect size for general psychological problems. You're seeing psychopathy and antisocial, and also employment instability showing up. But in terms of mental illness, not in the top 10. Now, this is stalking. If take a look, you see psychotic disorder, there aren't 10, so there's nothing to be top 10 on this one, but it's a negative sign. That actually means that in this, and these are all reviews of the literature, these are meta-analyses, I guess I should have told you that. These are studies of studies where they're combining all that's published and to look at these strength of effect sizes. And what that shows is that people with psychotic disorders are actually less likely to engage in stalking than people without mental illness. I think that that's an important thing, is that it's listed up there, but it has a negative sign. It means it's inversely related. It's less likely to engage in stalking. And that's in a meta-analysis. Public shootings in mass shootings in public places. This is percentages. The U.S. Secret Service looks at a number per year, what the characteristics of mass shootings in public places are. Mental illness is not in the top 10. There is mental health diagnosis there, but it's not necessarily the three that we're looking at. It's not been, and they're definitely not been confirmed. It's just what the information they had. And so I think that that's important. And then targeted school violence, we hear about this. Mental illness is not in the top 10 again. And I know that I'm going through these quickly, but hopefully you'll be able to watch it. It's not totally critical that these are all reports that are available, but really the take-home message is on the left side, You don't see mental illness, but you see all these other things. And then this chart. This I got. This is on Wikipedia. You can see and collect. This is not like a massive data collection effort, but I was curious to see divide up the mass shooters by 10, or who have 10 or more victims by sex and age. And what you could see here is that it's younger males, and this is shown in a lot of the studies that you saw above. And I think it's tough to look at this figure and to say that mental illness is the cause of violence. It is hard to do that. And it's, in fact, hard to do that for all the figures I just showed you, because it was not. And there's others that I looked at too. There's a lot of different reviews that are out there. You could see the different kinds of violence. But what I could tell you is that there was no pattern of mental illness showing strong effect size. If it was there at all, it showed it was small or moderate at most. But in one case, it was negatively related. I think this evidence shows that going beyond that, is mental illness linked to violence, but asking instead, how strong is that link? It is very difficult to look at the science and to say that it is strong. Like, it's not, again, that odds ratio is not one. There is a link, and they are on those lists. So mental illness, and I think that it's important to take away from this that it's a complicated end result of this. To say that there's no relationship. Well, we see that symptoms might be related and there is something there, but to say that it's the top reason for it is an exaggeration of the link, and you saw what they were. And in fact, let's go back to the puzzle pieces. So the reason why I said you don't need to memorize or all those different figures is I've actually, how when you do a jigsaw puzzle, you take I should have had this here. You take the box and you spill them all out and you start making piles based on, let's say, the color of the tiles or what have you. You start making piles, and what you begin to see when you look at all these different risk factors is one pile are things that are going on the outside of a person. Unemployment, social stressors, being bullied at school, you see that's external. Then there's a bunch of factors that are internal, that are inside. So anger, substance abuse, hostility. But then there's this last category. And these are, if you look in the dictionary at those risk factors, you will find either something about violence or criminality or both. And so those are violence defining risk factors, because internal and external factors, they might increase a person's risk statistically. But if you look in the dictionary for financial strain or emotional dysregulation, that's not by definition related or regarding violence and crime. And it increases it, but it's not necessarily related to it. Whereas those violence defining risk factors, they both increase the likelihood of violence, and they enable violence to be seen as a viable and acceptable option. It's a necessary condition. So you look those up, and those are all criminal thinking, being influenced by groups encouraging hatred and preoccupation with guns. Those are all, by definition, relate to crime. So really, the way to think about this is, if violence occurs, you want to look for those straight edge. Just like in a jigsaw puzzle, you usually do the straight edges first, so you get the frame of the puzzle. And that's the same with violence. There are these violence defining necessary risk factors that frame and define the violence, just like the straight edges. So once you start doing that, once you start thinking about, I'm going to go back for a second, Because you could see the problem is that you could even see it in this. If people are only focusing on the mental illness, they're literally like if they're over exaggerating what's right there, that one mental illness piece, they are by definition not paying attention to the rest of the factors there. Many, and if not most of them, stronger predictors. And that's a real problem, both for increasing stigma of mental illness, but also for keeping us safe. Because I want to just offer this. If mental illness is a weak factor, we're focused on that as our violence prevention, and it's only 5% of the violence. That is spending way too much attention on something that's not going to make a huge difference. Whereas once you start to look at, wait, there's external risk factors, there's internal risk factors, there's violence defining risk factors, it opens up a whole host of different ways to prevent violence. And I'm going to show you some of them. So, simple. Randomized trial. This is in Science. And they randomized disadvantaged high school students in high violence neighborhoods. They gave them a summer job. Look at that. 43% less likely in the next year and a half. That's addressing, and there are other nuances in that study too, where they actually, for some of those people, some of those students who had the summer job, they provided some extra counseling, and then they felt actually more self-efficacy and better about their futures. And so you could see that addressing this is, and this has nothing to do with mental illness. This is just summer job. You can build, there's a ton of research on family psychoeducation and family interventions that can be used to curb family violence. And then this is literally one of my favorite studies that I found in my research for this today. It was in a city in a neighborhood below the poverty line. And they literally randomized vacant lots. And in some of those lots, they did nothing. They just left it be. And the other half of those lots, they planted trees, grass. They got rid of trash. And they maintained it for about a year. It can start with planting a tree. 9 to 29% decrease in gun violence. There were a lot of other reducing crime. People felt safer, perceived safety, you name it. And just very quickly as an aside, a randomized controlled clinical trial is sort of the gold standard of doing research. And they were able to do it in a city and decrease gun violence by just planting a tree. I think that there are a number of great. I think one of the things that I hope that everyone knows about, if you or your family has experienced trauma, is the National Center for PTSD. On their homepage, they have it's a YouTube video that in 5 minutes will describe evidence-based practices for PTSD. And so there are incredible treatments that have shown to be very strong at helping people who've experienced this. And also, and this is something that is, anger was one of the stronger risk factors in some of those studies. And there have been studies that have consistently showed a big meta-analysis, cognitive behavioral therapy. SAMHSA has a free cognitive behavioral therapy workbook on their website, and that has been shown to reduce both criminal and violent recidivism. A lot of mindfulness interventions, and there's a ton of apps now for that. That's also been shown to potentially ease emotion dysregulation and reduce violence and aggressiveness. Now, remember, a lot of those studies were showing co-occurring substance use and mental illness. So what has been found about psychotropic medications and treatment and violence? Well, unlike some of the other areas I just talked about, where there are meta-analyses, like the anger management, there are actually only a handful of studies. There's 2 studies on clozaril showing reduced aggression and schizophrenia. I could not, and I still don't know of any randomized trials for reducing violence in bipolar disorder or major depressive disorders. But I think another thing that's really important, and I may be getting this wrong, so I apologize. But I think that none of those studies specifically enrolled people with co-occurring mental illness and substance use. And we definitely saw from the studies above that that is the very those are the individuals with mental illness at high, at a number of them are at higher risk. So, but only, and this is SAMHSA data from a couple of years ago, only a fraction of them are actually getting treatment for both. So integrated dual disorders treatment could be an optimal way to address that in the highest risk, set of individuals with mental illness who also have substance abuse. What about those violence defining factors? So virtual reality, there's a study out of Stanford that people were asked to take the place of other people, and actually they've showed improved empathy and perspective taking. It was a very exciting way that, and there also are cognitive behavioral and behavioral approaches to preventing antisocial behavior, but I just wanted to highlight some of the use of technology that can be used. And then this was in some of the reports that the United States Secret Service had, is there were a lot of perpetrators of mass shootings and targeted school violence that were influenced by groups encouraging hate and violence. And so there could be an adaptation of those strategies that have reduced gang membership, and they're talking about that for reducing influence of hate groups. And lastly, gun safety and safe storage of firearms. And there's a lot out there that we could have an entire hour about, but I want to just highlight what is known. And what is known from this RAND report is that the waiting periods and background checks actually were associated strongly with firearm homicides, and that the prohibition for domestic violence restraining orders actually reduced it. But relevant to the talk, and is anything to do with mental illness was inconclusive. Anything to do with mental illness was inconclusive in that report. So what do we take from this? Yes, it's complex and multifaceted, but if after seeing all of this, I hope the one thing that you take away is all those puzzle pieces. There are a lot more factors at play. It's hard. It is possible that mental illness could be the sole cause of violence, but it's hard to see that, because that person very likely has potentially other risk factors. The mental illness doesn't exist in a vacuum. And regardless, what happens is, with the public attention, and I think 40% of you correctly saying that it's perceived as the top cause, there are a lot of stronger risk factors that need to be considered. So what to do? Well, when violence happens, instead of just asking, okay, yeah, is there a link between violence and mental illness? We need to ask other questions. What else is going on? What else is going on? And that will help open up the dialogue to the multiple causes of violence. It will help balance. It's so imbalanced when there's only on mental illness. It'll help create more balance by looking at, well, was this person under financial strain? What was their social support, family, stable employment, housing? Could they regulate their anger? Were they young? Were they male? Were they abusing drugs, alcohol? How do they respond to trauma or bullying? That information may never come to light, but it's important to ask that because those are also other pieces that may or may not be at play that they could have something to do with mental illness, but it also says, we need to look at other factors. It's not just mental illness. And more importantly, are those what is it that made that person think that violence was okay, and what helped facilitate them? What helped them carry out the violence? Why was it an acceptable and viable option for them? Did they lack empathy, compassion? Did they have access to lots of lethal weapons? Were they influenced by groups encouraging hatred? Or did they have attitudes that said, hey, violence is okay and justified? But on top of that, criminal beliefs. There had to be somewhere where it was not wrong to break the law and hurt other people. There's a lot of other things going on at play, and it's important for us to ask that. It's not only important for us to ask that when violence happens, but we need to think about in terms of preventing violence, what else do we need to do? Because if you only focus on the mental illness, you're only getting a small, weaker risk factor. You need to open it up to addressing the social environment, substance abuse, lack of gun safety, antisocial traits like lacking empathy, anger, jobs, financial well-being. There's a ton of different things that can be done to reduce risk of violence beyond just looking at the mental illness. It's going to lead to better interventions for public safety. If we don't move beyond that knee-jerk reaction and repeatedly blaming mental illness for violence, it will not only increase stigma if we don't do it. If we can look at these other risk factors and these other preventative strategies for violence, we'll be able to avoid bias. We'll be able to avoid stigma. We won't neglect the significant contributors. And in a way, we'll all be safer because we'll be able to really increase our ability to prevent violent tragedies. Thank you so much.
Well, Eric, that was comprehensive and thoughtful, and I want to thank you for offering your email address. I'm going to give you a micro break. I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that don't involve this topic per se. Will people get the slides? The answer, if you signed up for this webinar, you'll get the slides in about a week, and the audio and video will be posted on the NAMI website in 1 week. Why do some of the numbers in the survey add up to more than 100? People were invited to say more than one thing was important to them. So there's not a problem with that. People say, I'm a family member and I have my own lived experience. I'm a family member. I'm a professional. This is important to me, and this is important to me, and this is important to me. Many people talked about their own traumatic experiences. And I wanted to go back to, the trauma resources that you mentioned, because of course, from the 30,000 foot level, people conflate mental illness and violence all the time. And occasionally it really happens to people and it's very traumatic. What kind of resources do you have in mind for them?
Thanks, Ken. And I think that is one of the things that I wanted to express at the beginning, that I understand and really understand that this could have impacts on your lives in such profound ways. I think that what I said about the National Center for PTSD, there are these evidence-based treatments. They're cognitive processing therapy, prolonged exposure therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. Those have all been shown to be incredibly helpful. And so to search for therapists who have expertise and training in those can really go a long way to helping address any traumas that you might be experiencing. It is really a lot of work has been done.
Thank you. Many people were hoping you were going to discuss when people with mental illness are victims of violence from police interactions. And I want to call out that there's multiple Ask the Experts. If you look on our website, we've had 988 Crisis Reimagined. We've had crisis intervention training. We've had how to reduce bad outcomes like suicide and pretrial detention, that we've tried to attend to this idea of a jail diversion mindset and improved police training. Feel free to email Ask the Expert if you have somebody specific in mind, and we'll consider, what we could do. Somebody asked about police training in Utah. People asked, the police killed my family member. How can I make a difference from that? So we're pretty actively allied on 988 Reimagine Crisis Care. 988 is the 3-digit number that gets you to a trained person, now in Spanish, now with American Sign Language. And we also have been pretty active with Crisis International. And so CIT, Crisis International Training. And the idea is police officers can learn to de-escalate situations, but somebody has to get them to free up the time for their officers to have 40 hours of training, right? So that's pretty good evidence that that works, but it requires leadership of the police department because training takes time. A couple other things I'm going to give the good doctor a break on. How do I establish boundaries in my families? We have Dr. Javier Amador on February 15th. He'll be discussing working with things like boundaries for people in your family who don't accept help, don't believe they are ill. Another person asked, are you going to talk about work? Because you mentioned what a salve for people's risk was work. We're happy to say on April 19th, we have Bob Drake, who invented supported employment, and some people who've gotten work. And so you'll be able to talk to them directly, and they'll talk about the impact of work on their self-esteem. All right, I think that's everything for the pre-questions. Now we'll come to the many questions. And obviously you can't know everything, but you've done a comprehensive review of the research. One of the most common questions is about how do you define mental illness, right? So is psychopathy outside of that?
Yeah.
Is psychosis a part of the definition of mental illness, but it's only a small part? So that question came up, I would say, in 10 different ways. What's the definition of this?
Yeah, and I think that is really spot on important because that lack of clarity on it actually can contribute to misconceptions of mental illness. So psychopathy, which actually is one of the stronger predictors of violence, it's not in the diagnostic statistical manual. It's a list of character traits that are related to both their antisocial character traits, lacking empathy, engaging in criminal thinking, but that's not a mental illness. And it's not a mental disorder, even in the DSM. And I think the fact that the word psychopathy and psychosis are so close, I think that is unfortunate. I think there's another term called sociopathy that has been used to mean something similar, and I think that would help. That is more that this is someone that is more antisocial. But yes, it is unfortunate that psychopathy, which is really someone who lacks remorse, and that is a scientific term, but is not mental illness. And in terms of what those studies were about for mental illness, they were psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, and major depressive disorders. But there's a lot of other mental disorders too, and there's I think 100 different categories in the DSM, and so it really. But I think when people hear, oh, they have mental health problems, unfortunately, it begins to be that's where things become unclear. But generally, they don't mean dementia, they don't mean opioid abuse, they don't mean spider phobia. Those are all mental disorders, but that's not what the public usually means by mental illness when it comes to these violent acts.
Sociopathy, psychopathy are outside of this definition.
Outside. Yeah, there's not
Psychosis,
mental
bipolar
illness.
disorder, schizophrenia, clearly within this definition.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's talk about treatment. I think many people have the observation that their family member is less, and occasionally more, likely to engage in violence when they're engaged in treatment or on certain medications or in therapy. Have you reviewed that literature?
I actually contributed a little bit to it and have found that people with mental disorders who are adherent to medications, who perceive treatment is helpful and perceive benefits from treatment, all three of those do report lower rates of violence. So that is, and symptoms were shown in that MacArthur study to relate to violence. So to the extent that reducing certain like hostility and anger and grandiose delusions, to the extent that the treatments help with those and being adherent to those. And I would really think the other thing is asking, do you feel like you need this? And do you feel like this is beneficial? That also added beyond just thinking about just the adherence issue. So getting what someone who's taking those medications, what they think about it, I think has been linked to reduced violence.
You mentioned substance use is a big challenge in the violent space.
Yeah.
There's some specific questions about marijuana or other specific substance use issues. Do you have thoughts about that population? Because our system is poorly designed to attend to people who have both. It's pretty well established.
Yeah.
Have you had thoughts about that? Is, for instance, medication-assisted treatment for opiate use disorder? Have there been studies on violence in that population? Use of marijuana has pretty clearly shown to increase your risk of psychosis if you use it early and you have a family history.
Yeah.
But, you know, what have you reviewed that literature?
I know a little bit about that literature. I could say that alcohol use is very strongly related to violence, and there I'm not aware that they've really divided up when there's a in the statistical the variable is substance use. It's usually like any substance use because there's a lot of it's tough to parse out because a lot of times people are using more than one. And so it's been hard to isolate the real effects. And also, the measurement itself is difficult in a study because you're asking people to tell you about their substance use. So it's a tricky one to figure out. I can say the link between it's kind of interesting. The link between substance use and violence, we know that it's there, but there could be a lot of different reasons for it.
Mm.
So it might be that someone is withdrawing and so they're agitated, or they're disinhibited while using a certain substance, or they're involved in some kind of criminal activity while, and they are violent while getting the substance,
Mm.
an illegal drug, or there might be self-medicating for mental health. There's like a lot of different reasons why substance abuse might be related to violence, and I think that it would behoove if that's the case, what it could be different for different people. I think that would be, but they're definitely it's a pretty strong finding. It's one of the most consistent findings. I think I could be getting this wrong, but I think alcohol is connected to about a third of homicides in the world. I mean, it's definitely a very strong risk factor.
People are asking about the media and their emphasis on this. I'm going to offer an observation. Since COVID, I have not been asked one question about the relationship between mental illness and mass violence.
Mm.
And I think that some of the work you're doing, some of the people at Apple, some of the people at NAMI, some of the people on this call are doing, the media is getting the idea that it's not a one-to-one correlation because they're calling me about other interesting questions.
Yeah.
But I think somehow, collectively, the media has not made this as much of a focus because it used to be a central focus a decade ago. I don't know if you've studied the media literature, but I feel based
Yeah.
on my experience, and I do hundreds of calls a year with the media, pre-COVID, this was common, but fading. Post-COVID, people are interested in all the other questions.
Ken, I still see it though occasionally. So like about, I don't know, a year ago there was someone in Texas, he took hostages at a synagogue.
Hmm.
And it was very big news, but within 24 hours, the hostage taker's brother had, it was the headline news in it didn't matter whether political, it was the New York Post and the New York Times had identical headline news, brother says mental illness. And and the problem is that by the time the rest of the information came out, which is this person had a big criminal record, and they had extremist ideas, and the list of other risk factors was endless. No one, it was already on to the next story.
Mhm.
And so there's still, even the Uvalde shooter, the second worst school shooting, was only a year or so ago. Immediately mental illness was blamed for it. So but any evidence that there was mental illness it has not come to light. Instead, he was on hate, he had turned 18 years old. He bought weapons right after that, and he had a lot of online hatred that he had already been spewing out, and was on online groups that were about that. So I think that by the time that other news came on, it still
Yeah.
was a lot of the media, unfortunately, was still blaming mental illness.
Yeah, what related to that, one of the questions, noted that politicians seem to like to blame the mental health system because of their ongoing interest in the pursuit of guns. So there's no question there, but several
Yeah.
questions were aligned in this space. How do people develop a narrative to suit their purposes?
Mm.
So I want to thank you for this talk. It's comprehensive and thoughtful. I want to mention to people who have suffered trauma, we will be doing Trauma Ask the Experts. Our heart goes out to you, and it's a lot when that is the case. And I want to thank you, Dr. Elbogen, for making yourself available with your email. And he'll do his best. So he's a researcher, and he's done his best to follow this literature, which is complicated, but I think all points in a similar direction, which is that the narrative isn't nearly as simple as the one-to-one correlation that many people assume. So I'm going to ask to go to the next slide, please. And so here we have coming up, Javier Amador is going to discuss people who lack awareness of illness. We're going to be talking with Marlene Freeman, one of my old residents, who is one of the leading thinkers on the use of medications when you have a mental health condition and you're planning to get pregnant, when you're pregnant, and postpartum depression. There was just a new oral compound approved by the FDA yesterday for the first time for postpartum depression. And then, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about supported employment with Bob Drake, Peggy Swarbrick, and many others. Again, what our endeavor is to get the best thinkers, the best researchers, the best clinicians to you in this webinar. And I'm very excited about this lineup. as I was about today's talk. Let's go to the next slide, please. From a shameless commerce perspective, I wrote NAMI's first book. I interviewed 130 real people who used their names because I felt that the idea that what you've been through, you have also learned something. And I hadn't seen one book where people were asked what they had learned to manage their own system, their own illness process, how to find help, how to improve communication in their family. This book, all the royalties go to NAMI, and we're closing in on 50,000 books. It was a USA Today bestseller. Let's go to the next slide, please. So remember, you're not alone. And if you liked NAMI, you like this webinar, feel free to donate. Let's go to the next slide. This is not a medical advice program. This is to provide you with information. My name is Ken Duckworth. I'm Ken at NAMI.org. Apparently, there's only one person named Ken at NAMI, despite the recent Barbie movie and the uptick in babies born with my name. There's still only one guy named Ken. If you have suggestions or thoughts about the webinar, Ask the Expert at NAMI.org is the place that you would do that. We do our best to read every email and to take into consideration what people want. The next three webinars that we have are really directly from the feedback. Let's talk about people who don't accept help. Let's talk about medications in pregnancy. Let's talk about work. And so I want to say we appreciate you attending. And let's go to the next slide, please. I think that's the last slide. So let me just say thank you, everybody. Thanks to Dr. Eric Elbogen for your research on this work. Again, you look at these slides, you will get a recording of this. Take a look at some of the other Ask the Experts, because I think we touched upon some of the other issues that some of you were hoping that we would cover. So let me say thank you, have a great evening, and thank you for joining.